Hey, welcome to this episode of Blue Collar Wealth. On this episode, we're going to talk about snowbirds. Do you find yourself having that strong desire to get the heck out of Dodge and get to warmer places, get to a different location, move closer to your family, change your residence? Basically, that's what we're talking about in this video. So I'm asking Kirk Lunger, one of my partners at Stonehouse and one of our key advisors. Kirk does a lot of work with clients that are dealing with these questions every day. And we're going to cover a ton of topics as we go through looking at real estate and whether it makes sense to you and what you should be looking for and things that you need to really weigh in making that decision. So if you like what you hear at the end of the video, feel free to click into our website through our links or through our website and reach out to us and ask us for an appointment, because I think what you'll hear Kirk talk about is ultimately really the easiest way to maybe come to some of the conclusions, or at least narrow down your choices and what you're looking for, is to maybe sit with somebody that has a lot of experience going through this with people. And Kirk certainly is one of those advisors. So stay tuned and let's go. Okay, Kirk Lunger, thank you so much, brother, for joining me. One of my teammates here, fellow advisors and partner here at Stonehouse. And Kirk, I asked you to come in today because we did this video. I did this video, I don't know, a year or so ago. It was about snowbirding. It was about renting how to find a place if you're moving to warmer weather, whatever you want to do. But it seemed to be like one of our the most popular video, right? So I know I'm 52. I don't what was the old comedian that said, I don't want to move to Florida, but I'm 52, so I have to. I have no intent to move there, at least today, but I do love vacationing and anything warmer than where it is where we live, for at least a couple months out of the year. But we see a lot of clients going through, especially as they're headed into retirement. Hey, I think I want a snowbird. And it doesn't always mean south, right? It can mean out west. It can mean even up north sometimes. It doesn't really matter where to us. The question is why, right? So we have a couple bullet points. I asked you to help me on this. You gave me an awesome sheet with bullet points. So we're going to go through that. The first one you had was their why factor, as you call it. So can you explain that, what that's about?
Yeah, it boils down to a lot of what we've talked about internally in our office when we share these types of stories we're having with clients to grow as a group around more than just kind of a second home, but an additional investment, whether it's, an RV lot down in Florida, right, or a second property, regardless of where that is, but it's meaningful to someone and their why factor of what is the driver.
Right.
And so there are a lot of conversations that we have more and more frequently as we help clients throughout this retirement journey, where it's not always immediate. It's oftentimes, a year in, 2 years, 3 years in of saying, boy, I might enjoy spending part of the year somewhere else. And so that's when kind of understanding their why is really where we like to start, because we can help share some of those common experiences from conversations we've had from other clients, and not even just the numbers, but listening and talking with our investors on what was their methodology and decision making and what was their why. I can sometimes replicate that when talking to the next person,
right, yeah,
and use those kind of scenarios to help give more informed conversations to the next person.
It's the same thing when you go to your doctor. The last thing you want your doctor to say is, geez, I've never seen anything like this before. Right?
Right.
So we've seen it a lot. And
yeah.
I think that makes our clients feel better. Like, hey, we're pretty sure we know what you're about to go through. And so if that's the case, here's what you can expect. Here's what we can plan for.
There's so many different ways to do it. I've told most people, and we'll talk later about this, there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's your way. And that's kind of what our job really, I think, is to listen, try and get a better understanding of what are you trying to do, and then what is your why, and then how can we help you facilitate it. I say I've seen people look at it and they like to do RVing. So they'll look to find an RV park where they can take their RV down and maybe go about it that way, where it's a temporary period. And then others that go, I have no interest in that. There's, a ton of headaches I don't want to deal with. And so, what are the pros and cons of doing option A versus option B?
Yeah.
And that's really where I think it starts is, well, why are you looking to spend this time elsewhere? What are you looking to accomplish? And then we kind of just keep digging deeper from there.
And common things are closer to the family.
Yep.
just all around nicer climate year round. As my knees might get a little bit more sensitive each year, I can get that. I understand that. Closer to the family. What else? What are other reasons?
So, I mean, some of it is just duration of time. Do I want to be there for more than just a vacation? So, we have a lot of folks that will sometimes kind of walk before they run, where it might be, I'm going to visit a friend down in Florida for a couple days, a week. And, so it kind of snowballs that way, where it turns into 2 weeks, a month, 2 months. Boy, maybe I want to be down here for the winter season.
Right.
So, the few you named first off are most common. I've had clients that have had kids that have relocated after they went to college and found jobs. And so, now then, it was the right time for them to maybe relocate closer to them. I've had folks that just want to get out of the cold, like you've just described, and done the traditional snowbird, whether it's January to March or October to May.
Yeah.
It tends to follow a similar pattern. When people start to figure out what they like, then they just continue to grow and build off of that.
Yeah. One of the other things that's interesting is when, as you start to really think through, I'm going a little off on tangent, which is what I'm known for, but when you start to think about like what you think you want versus what you might actually settle on. And I say that because you just brought up an interesting point, which is kind of like practice vacation, right?
Yes.
Like instead of just going somewhere for a week, you could almost love anywhere for a week, right?
Yeah.
At least most of it. But if you stay there for 2, 3, maybe a month, you start to notice some things like, I don't know if I would like that every day,
Sure.
right?
And I think
just little stuff, right? And I think it starts to add up. For example, I'm a do-it-yourself weekend warrior. I grew up building houses, so I love, fiddling around on our house and remodeling and stuff. And I've always thought I would want a house that I could just spend all my free time remodeling and messing with. But number one, you get older. You have less interest in physically doing all that stuff. Number two, depending on where you go, you may have to get a whole bunch of permission before you touch anything on your house, depending on codes and all kinds of laws where you are and zoning issues. So think very closely about that. And I'd never thought even I would ever consider it, but a lot of folks would immediately rule out the idea of like a condo, that they can't personally get too much into the remodeling side of it, but that might be perfect for you.
It's a pro and a con. For one person, it's a negative.
trade-off.
For the next person, there's a ton of positives.
That's right.
And so I think what you hit on is what I like to call and talk with clients around vacation mindset versus your living mindset. And,
right.
When we go on vacation, especially during your working years, you're unplugging R&R, and you're probably spending more money.
Yeah,
you're going to go out to dinner. You're going to do all those things that, hey, we're here for a few days or a week or 10 days, whatever it is. And so because of that, you just make different decisions than if I'm here for 3 weeks, a month, or 6 months. Well, now I'm living.
Right.
I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to walk the dog. I'm going to go grocery shopping. Where's the hardware store? What about my pharmacy?
Yeah.
All those little things that when you're on vacation, it doesn't matter. It's a little bit further of a ride, or, I don't really know where it is. We'll just go find it and then come back because, it's temporary. But when you start to make it more than just a vacation, all those little things become important. And so that's one of the differences, and kind of leads into the conversation that there's a lot of different things to consider around, well, do I want to invest more significantly and own? Do I want to rent and build that in and have more flexibility on that end?
Mm-hmm. And that's on your list here. So I think you use the term about how comfortable somebody is, right?
Right.
With owning and not an investment just per se, but a real estate investment, which is definitely different than owning a mutual fund or a stock, right? So how do you sort through that with somebody to find out exactly their comfort level?
Yeah. So, this starts down that pathway of having the candid conversations around if I'm owning a second property, and unlike just kind of out here where we live, where it might just be vacant land that we go hunting on, there's not a lot of upkeep for that.
Right.
But now when I'm investing in a second property where there's a structure, and now there's upkeep, there's maintenance, there's the actual cost of the property itself, it's kind of thinking, well, how long am I going to use that? Because the shorter the time frame, what are you doing with that when you're not there? So obviously in northeastern Pennsylvania, a lot of folks, when we're talking about this, are not talking just about Lancaster, where you're a 3-hour ride away going, hey, I could get there if there was an emergency pretty quickly.
Yep.
But when you start talking about South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, for folks that we have that move to more of these warmer climates, well, if there's an emergency and I need to get there, I'm going to need to rely on others to assist with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's just thinking about, well, what is the usage of my time going to be and how much am I going to be comfortable investing in that? Because that's that pro and con list just to start there.
Yeah, because that when you say the usage, it's you have two factors that go into any sort of issue you have, right? It's time and usually money.
Right.
Or one or the other, usually both, and usually more in each category than expected. But you have, as a retiree, you probably have the time. But if you can't get out there, as you're saying, then it's really going to come out of your pocket, and you got to find somebody that you can trust. And,
and is it worth the money? So part of the conversation with a lot of investors I talk with is if you're only thinking about using it for a month or two, then 10 out of the 12 months you're not using that.
Right.
It's not earning you any money. And that leads into the next conversation, which is how open are you to using this as maybe I don't want to call it a small business, but with so many options to make this easier between Airbnb, VRBO, real estate management companies that tend to be more popular in the areas our clients are looking at versus where we live.
Yeah. Right.
But similar to what we've talked, the first video we put out on this is just what is someone's initial impressions. My experience is usually it's a love-hate. I'm either open to it as a way to maybe subsidize some of this investment by generating income through rent and kind of leasing this out to others when I'm not using it. Or no, that's a big turnoff. I don't want someone in my space. It would make it uncomfortable, or it's just not something I'm interested in thinking about today.
Right.
But it's a starting point because it's just another layer to this onion to kind of see, well, how would this work for you? Because this isn't something that generally, in my experience, you have to have way more money than you ever know what to do with to try and invest in another property. I've had plenty of investors that have kind of come in with some goals that just continued to take different forms over time that would have said 20 years ago, I never would have thought this was possible.
Yeah.
That we've pulled it off today. And they're not generally people that would come in and say, I've got way more money than I ever know what to do with.
Yeah.
But they're reasonable everyday people that said, hey, I've just worked hard, I've planned, and I've tried to get better informed as to, is this reasonable and something I'm willing to take some risk on? Because there's risk in anything.
Yeah. One of the things, when you talk about risk, one of the things that pops in my head, and I feel like I can't remember the acronym or the fable that goes along with this, but the constantly crying wolf or whatever, but there are bubbles in real estate.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's very nice is typically, and this goes back to your original comment, it depends on where that client and what they're looking to do, where they're looking to go. But there is real estate risk. You could, all real estate eventually goes through ebbs and flows. Yep. Some of these more desirable places where retirees move are pretty filled and continue to grow. So there's a huge amount of liquidity. So that risk is very low today. If I buy a place and I'm wrong in a year and I need to sell that and go back, there's closing fees and things like that, but you could at least get out for roughly what you paid for it, maybe a little more, a little bit less. But if you're stuck somewhere and that bubble happens to burst while you're holding that property, we've seen it before. Since I've been in the business 20 some years, we've seen real estate where you get kind of stuck there and you're left holding a property that you owe, especially if you borrowed.
Yes.
You owe a lot of money and it's not worth what you paid and you're angry.
And that's more common, quite honestly, is if we, in my experience with the investors I'm most frequently working with, it's not always a cash transaction. Right. It can be, but it's not always. And so then that illiquidity that you're talking about with real estate that comes in then brings in those other variables of what is my thought process? Do I have any other debt on my other existing assets, or do I own them outright where I have some equity there? That I've had some conversations with investors where, well, we're looking to buy this additional property. We're not sure how much we're going to use it initially, but over time, as we continue to get further into our retired years, the conversation we have is, well, maybe you'll sell one and move more full-time to the other. There's that opportunity that's there. So it's really just that carrying cost every year, while you're still paying on that, to say how much risk is that? And that's a whole separate topic that we'll get into further later in terms of, well, how do I afford this? Very different than, well, why am I interested in doing this in the first place? Yeah,
because if you're jumping around, like we talked about that liquidity factor, right? So if you're jumping around, like every year you go, I want to be up in the panhandle of Florida. Like, no, now I want to be by the Keys. No, I want to be in Arizona. even if you're selling roughly for what you bought, you're just getting
renting might be better for you.
In fees. Yeah, right. Absolutely. Closing fees and costs and things like that. So, but that does happen. Now, so if you have money to burn and a huge, cushion, if you will, in your budget, you can afford to kind of be less frugal. But
you might want to take, you might be comfortable taking more risks than someone else. And that's why for a lot of folks, I personally like to see folks try it beyond just a vacation mindset. Like you just talked about in terms of locations, just using Florida as a very popular destination. Whether you're talking on the East Coast, West Coast, North, South, have you been there for more than just 7 to 10 days and just a vacation mindset? Try going for 2 weeks, because most likely if you can afford the actual purchase price of the real estate, you can afford renting it for a few weeks to give it more than just the vacation mindset. And then, like I talk about, and we talk about within our financial plans, flexibility is key. We joke about it as being our F word in the office.
Absolutely.
If you rent a place for a year, a full 1-year lease, and hate it, a lot easier to get out of.
Right. Yeah.
Here's the keys back, Mr. Landlord. Thank you so much. Wasn't worth for us.
Right.
And then if it is the perfect place, well, while you're down there, you could be then scoping out where you might want to plant down some deeper roots.
Yep. All right, I'm checking our mighty list here. And so going back to something you said earlier, vacation mode, how'd you say, vacation mode versus daily living?
Yeah.
How do you go into that? How do you determine what vacation mode is versus?
Yeah, I mean, that the first thing I often think about with clients is, is it somewhere they've been before, and where do they see themselves wanting to spend more time? Have they thought about the differences in terms of, I had an investor, as we're filming this week, that came back from kind of a dry run, if you will, the first time they've done it. They're not ready and at the stage to plant down deeper roots in terms of buying, but they wanted to try it for more than just a vacation. And so they spent a brief period of time in a warmer area. And what they learned this year was, it was still pretty cold where they were in January.
Okay.
Not as cold as what it was where they're used to and from, but at the same time, not as kind of ideal of the climate that they were thinking of. But from the last few years that we've been working together and, when they've been looking at doing some traveling in the kind of winter months, Florida's too warm for a longer term perspective for them. And that's a pretty common scenario I've seen, that for someone that might see a longer term investment, I don't know if I want to be down there when it's 100 degrees.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's
it's 100 degrees.
Right. So, I mean, that's a detriment for someone to say, well, maybe I don't want to own, but I want to build into my financial plan. What if I did spend a little bit more money, or how would that look, if I wanted to then use that for a shorter period? So, back to kind of the usage idea, I'll look at if someone's there 2 to 4 months, that's thinking what it is, then, I think you could easily ease into that over the next few years before you actually kind of pull the trigger and purchase a property, because it could give you the opportunity to try it for more than just 1 year or just one trip. So, that's generally where I'll start with folks is, have you been there for an extended period beyond a week?
Right.
Because that's when, you start to really look for where are all those other places you'll do business versus just, where are we going to dinner?
Yeah. And I guess I would want to add in a little extra on that is when somebody comes to me and they say, I kind of cringe when somebody's like, well, we think we're going to end up in, I won't name a town. I don't know why I don't want to be biased toward a town, but XYZ, right? Such and such town, because our friends are there and they love it.
Yes.
And then I see them go and they're like, wow, wasn't what we expected. We want to move. We want to do something different. And they're really shocked, right? Well, I go through this with my wife all the time. She knows I talk about this. It's like, we're different than the house next door and the house on the other side of that and the other side of that. Like, everybody's got a different scenario. So I think sometimes we kind of get overwhelmed because it's number one, it's a privilege. It's a wonderful thing to be able to think to yourself, we could afford to buy a second home or to vacation for extended period, like a month or 3 months, or pick up and move completely. Like, This is a nice privilege we've worked our tails off to get to, right? But we have to really give it some thought about what you want. Otherwise, you're trying to keep up with the Joneses. And I was going to make this comment on the can you afford it section, but I'll just jump into it now. I see, and I've done this in one of my other videos, I've seen people go into a community or into a neighborhood And they are, I know you've seen this before, they are scraping at everything in their budget to be able to afford it. And I always tell people, you don't want to be one of the poorer people in a community. I don't care what scale or what expense ratio you're looking at for the cost of the house, but if you're one of the poorer people in that community, you're going to constantly be trying to go and do the same things that all your friends that you're making new friends usually. And the next thing you know, it's just the stress. And as people get older, they don't want the stress that they physically and mentally can't really handle it as well as they did when they were 30, 40 years old, when there was a lot of stressful things happening. And so they just kind of want to more relax and kick back. And when that happens, when you find yourself trying to keep up with all your neighbors and friends, it just stretches the wallet and it just makes for an unenjoyable thing. And I'm not saying, live under a rock or out of your car, but I'm saying be wise about, could you buy a $150,000 home in a community where they average 150, or do you want to buy a $300,000 home in an area where they average $1 million?
Sure. And
then you're always trying to upgrade your house and keep up. And it could be really stressful. And I've seen that a bunch of times.
Yeah, me as well. And one of the things I think about my family, we loved RV. And this is something that as we got interested in this before we even bought our first RV, and now we've owned several, is buy it for yourself and your immediate needs, not necessarily your immediate family and your adult children and your grandchildren, you and your significant other. That is where you should be starting this conversation from. What are your needs? Because the further you extend out, and that's what was talked about when we first started kind of digging into what would be the right RV, is how many people are going to come over? How much people are going to use this? It's never as much as you think.
right.
So you're going to be the one using it all the time. What are your needs? What are your financial capabilities to be able to handle this type of purchase and investment? And then what are maybe some of the additional benefits? Oh, if someone wanted to come down and use that or something like that together, then that's different. Now, again, every situation is custom. There's no one size fits all here. This has to be tailored to you. But as we talked about in kind of our prep for this is, I oftentimes do see people, I think sometimes thinking about family and friends more than themselves. And I think that's a great point. Besides keeping up in the Joneses in the area you might be going with, don't try and keep up the Joneses in your current community because others are doing this and feel like, well, we're missing out or we're falling behind because we're not doing that. Really focus on why are we doing this? What are we getting out of it? Because to your point, you're the ones that worked for this and for so many years and decades planned and prepared. You don't want to make too impulsive of a decision and then go, oops. Not that there's not ways to get around it. I mean, this isn't the end of the world, but you could just based off of timing or overreaching go, oh, that wasn't a great end up resolution we were looking for.
I will say that this is my admission on camera. The one area of my life where my socks have been knocked off is the RV world. When you mention RV, because when you're talking RV, it's not what I think in my head. I mean, I grew up going across the country with my parents. In the back of a cab with a cap on it.
I'm not roughing it with 2 air conditioners, a kitchen, a microwave. My kids have their own beds. Like it's not roughing it.
When I see what some of our clients have, and they say the RV park, I'm picturing waking up in the tent with dew on my face and I see these monstrosities. I was like, wow, these things are amazing. And you know what? It's something that I hadn't even thought about. Now I do. It's a real viable and really amazing option.
I have clients that have desires in terms of their travel, where to them it's traveling the continental United States, possibly all over North America. And then I have others, it's traveling to Florida. That's their primarily usage for it. So again, as an RV enthusiast, I've learned a lot in the last 7-8 years we've been doing it. You can go to the state park, pitch a tent or put a travel trailer in there, and it's very economical and you're going to get a great feel and you're out in nature. You can go to a $300,000 RV community where that's what it costs to buy a lot. And so you there's the stretch of where you want to go. You can go to a beautiful turnkey resort in Myrtle Beach, that is far more expensive than a state park in Pennsylvania.
Yep.
They're a little different. So, you can tailor it to your needs, but the same thing as someone's buying a home, a second home, well, what do we need versus what do we want? And then how do those two come together?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really important. And this is a good segue into that last topic about affordability.
Yeah.
So I think it's very, very important for clients to understand when they often ask, like, can I afford to retire? That's like probably the most common question we have. But I think coupled with that question or suggestion is living within your budget.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't even have to, I know that's just like a swear word. People don't like to talk about the budget word, right?
Yeah.
But you've built. And so if you are at that inflection point where you're sliding into retirement, it means your life is different. It doesn't mean it's close to being over, like some people say, right? It's the next chapter. It's like the next third of your life, whatever you want to say. My wife and I were talking about that last night, the next third of our life. I was like, I don't know. I would just say the next chapter. Don't put an end date on that thing. But nonetheless, if you stay with whatever you have at that point, and it can grow more, we certainly have seen that. But if you misuse it, you can lose it, right? Yep. Or you can put yourself behind the eight ball, and it's just some really good decision making. So how do you talk to somebody when they say, usually that's like, I'm going into retirement first, and then briefly after that, it's like, okay, now we've got our sights set on this. Do you think we can afford it, Kirk? Like, where do you start with somebody?
So I'll start. It's not as much, and the word I think sometimes can be off-putting, but it's the same concept. It's not just about your budget. Few people come in with a budget that goes, I've been itemizing my expenses down to the penny for the last 20 years, and I could tell you how much I spent on gas, groceries, and fuel.
Right.
That's not the norm.
Wrong.
Right. The reality is, what we try and do is, are you living within your means?
Yep.
And a lot of times people will tell us they are, and we sometimes have to have the reality check that, well, what you think is your means is potentially issues in the future. So one of the things that we'll look at in terms of the affordability is, well, have you been doing this for some time, proving out consistently that you're able to be able to afford the same kind of standard of living for the foreseeable future, and what that looks like. And everybody's is different. Mm-hmm. So again, there's a lot of ambiguity in that, but that's one of the first things that I look for is it sustainable? Are we still on the right track? Because like you talked about, retirement's a journey. It's not a sprint. For most people, it's a marathon. Again, life can throw you curveballs, so there's always that reality. But outside of that, in terms of, can I afford this? The first thing I think about is then focusing on, well, what are those base needs? Because this is something optional. Mm-hmm. It's not mandatory. This is something that's an extra. Yep. And so that's what I like to think about first, is really making sure, which is why for a lot of people I work with, it's usually something that happens in that kind of intermediate phase. It's not usually, okay, I retired, time to buy the second home.
Yeah.
Occasionally it is, but usually for those people, we've been talking about it, or they've been planning it for 5 years sooner. It's not usually something impulsive. So it's a process that we just continue to build on and then build out into their plan around, am I still living in my means if I make this investment? So kind of thinking back about what we were talking earlier, is there an opportunity for this to generate income for me? So again, the vacation mindset. Mm-hmm. If I go to St. Augustine, unless I'm an influencer and an Instagrammer, I'm not probably going to make any money off my trip to St. Augustine.
Right.
But if I'm now investing in a property, I don't know why I chose that, but just using that as in this example, well, now one of the first questions is, can I afford it? Is, are you open, or what is your initial thought on the times you're not using it? Would you be interested in trying to partake in generating income from it? Mm-hmm. And that can look different. There's a lot of different ways that you could go with that, or at least point people in the right direction of things to be thinking about. If the answer is no, it's an easier place to start, because, okay, now it's ruled out. So now let's move forward and let's talk about, well, what is the purpose of this 10 years from now? So if it's something you could see yourselves maybe spending more and more time at, then we start to look at and saying, well, what does your cash flow look like? We get into more of the numbers game, so then it becomes more black and white. And I don't want to say in our wheelhouse, everything to this point has, but a lot of this has been more just on the advice and guidance. And then, well, what are you looking to do? Now we're getting into brass tacks, as I like to call it, of, the meat and potatoes of this, if you will, of, well, where's the down payment going to come from? So if we are not paying cash for all of this, what does your current cash flow look like? Generally, that's met with, well, how much can I take out?
Yeah.
Well, do you want to take your whole account? Because you could if you wanted.
Right.
But most people are going to say, well, no, what do I then live off of? So, you have to start running some numbers to take a look at and go, what is that range that would allow me to not shortchange myself in the future, but yet be comfortable with this idea of saying, I might be okay if part of my estate is kind of invested in different real estate, whether that's, a primary and secondary home or an RV and then an RV lot. Those can appreciate as well. Sure. So again, there's, as the saying goes, many different ways to skin the cat. And so that's really where then from
it's really disgusting for you.
Maybe we can insert a different analogy.
I'm just kidding.
But that's to me where I like to start with this is in terms of affordability, we have to be looking at the idea of what is the cost of this going to be for you? And then what are the ways over time that it may cost less? Meaning, are you willing to think about in 5 or 10 years, if I was forced to sell one, am I okay with that?
Yeah. I think so one of the things that pops in my head is not only, most of our clients, many of our clients are from Pennsylvania-ish area, right? Sure. But we work with a lot of states now, and it gets bigger and bigger, which is fantastic. So really what it boils down to is something I think that people overlook is you just talk a lot about this property that you're going to purchase or start renting or living in or whatever. If you're not there all year, what could you do with that property? Maybe have it come the other way with income producing. Right. What about your house that you currently have?
Yeah.
Right. If you're leaving it vacant for 3 months, could you rent it? It really depends on where you are.
Right.
And I would usually say if it's not your typical destination point, there's probably low chance of doing that. But I see stuff on Airbnb and VRBO that are rent, and I'm thinking, how the heck are they filling that up?
Sure.
If you look at their calendars, they're filled. They're not necessarily every day, but there's certainly enough in there to help offset the cost of your snowbirding into another location.
And as we've seen, as clients have relocated in retirement, even just primarily of moving closer to family, well, those areas look different than what their home used to for 30 years. So, people that are maintaining 2 properties have that option that still says, well, I might not be next to a ski resort where someone wants to come to and be in Killington, Vermont, but there are different aspects to someone that says, hey, I own a modest piece of property where, generally when you go to Florida, you're not sitting on 40 acres. You could, but for the most part, you're not. Right. And so, we work with a lot of clients that do have acreage where that could be entertaining for someone that says, boy, they've got a beautiful pond and this very remote landscape that says, boy, privacy is worth it to me.
Yeah.
And so I think there's all different ways to come up with how can we make this work for you? And that's why I always tell people, our job isn't to tell them no. Yeah. Our job is to say, are we still kind of coloring inside the lines?
Yeah. Yeah, right. No, I think that's, I think you just nailed it on the head. I would say, I get excited when people want to talk about that because that actually, for me, this is a chance for us to show them our value that we bring to the table. We probably have a very intimate understanding of their situation. We probably are used to dealing with money in the situation, as we mentioned at the beginning of this thing, that our experience can really lend to their favor.
Yep.
And ultimately we're going to try to make it work.
Sure.
But we're also going to be very real and say you're going to be in really bad shape if you do this. Yeah. And how many times hey, I want to buy a boat. Yeah, well, you really can't afford it. And then a week later they go, I bought it. That's what it is. We have to work with them. We have to help them through that. Sure. and we'll try to help them recover. But, they're in control of their own destiny. But it's great to be that resource. I can tell you want to say something.
Yeah, well, we have that scenario. But I think often, too, about the greater number of scenarios is someone coming in that's talking everything that we are today, but they're not talking about Malibu beachfront real estate that goes, that's way out of their budget. Or, they're not typically talking about if it's an investor we have that has, $800,000 to $2 million. They're not looking to spend $800,000 to $2 million on a property. Mm-hmm. They're generally looking at something that's within their range of being reasonable. It's just how important is it to them to make this investment? And that's the main thing I start with. It's an investment, whether it's an RV, a second property, a piece of land, a boat. You worked hard for this money, to your point earlier. You're investing that capital. And so that's really what I think, the conversation shifts to and why I get just as excited as you do, because it's important to them. So let's make sure we're taking enough time and respect to say, hey, how can we help in this?
Right.
You know,
yeah, absolutely.
And sometimes help is saying you should not do this. But more times than not, it's, hey, here's how we could do this, or maybe not today, but here's a 5-year plan as to, well, maybe we think about that in that time frame. Because a lot of our clients, we're planning out for 10, 15, 20 years. You know, so as I think about that for a lot of folks I'm working with, it might be something we casually talk about this year, but it might be something you're interested in executing for 5 years. You know, so I mean, there's plenty of times we could help people with that idea of thinking in what we would kind of call that intermediate term time frame to say, well, how do I need to position my assets today between distributions, portfolio management, risk, in setting myself up for that. So, you know, a lot of times people are kind of maybe coming in with a good jumping off point, but there are other occasions where I say, if it is something that interests you, we can start planning today to build out that roadmap to get you there in 5 years, you know, and just maybe delay that gratification a little bit to give yourself more freedom to make that decision more comfortably. But that doesn't mean in the interim that you can't still be doing a lot of the same things to kind of kick the tires before you go make the purchase to go, is this how I really want to spend my hard-earned money?
Yeah. Practice your very strategic vacations to where you think you might want to go. Sample it. I always think of, and I use this in my video somewhere else. I always think of like my cousin Vinny with the giant loud whistles. Like didn't matter where they went, there was some sort of noise in the morning or a train or something like that. And sometimes when you're there for a 3-day trip or even a week, you don't pick up on some of that stuff.
Yep.
And I won't go into I have more stories, but
yeah.
Listen, this has been great. I told Lindsay and Anna it was going to be a little bit longer on these videos because you and I talk a lot, but this is a long topic. We could talk for another 2 hours, but is there anything that we didn't hit on this list? I think we hit most of the points.
Yeah. I think the main thing that I like to leave most people with is, you know, it's a process and it's a journey. It's not as simple as buying a car. And if someone thinks, boy, that can be a process, a journey, then double or triple it to be investing in something larger.
Yeah.
So, you know, I like to tell most people, it's not like we're climbing Mount Everest. I don't want to over exaggerate, but it is something that you want to spend time and thought. You want to come back with ideas, and hopefully we'll leave you with some more information than you had before from either what kind of mathematically could make sense, or, you know, with what you're trying to do. Here are some other ways that you might be able to do this that you hadn't thought of. But, you know, it's something that I try and advise most people, really make sure you take time focusing on why is this so important to us?
Yep.
Because I think that's something that, you know, a lot of times people come in and I want to buy a second home. Well, what do you want to do with that? Spend the time for the why, and then everything else we can work off of that.
Yeah. Yeah, if there's not a strong why there, then there's going to be challenges. And so you need that passion, that desire to make that happen.
That's right.
Yep. That's been great. I appreciate this time, brother. I don't know why I keep calling you brother. I'll call you in for another one for sure. In the meantime, we'll get back to work. Thank you very much for the time for this, Kirk. I appreciate it.
Sounds good.